And finally, we're going to describe the muscles of the hip and the lower limbs. How are these muscles, or how this group work? Now, the hip. Let's go back to the rubber band. If you place a rubber band from any point in the anterior aspect of your vertebral column, anywhere, and from there you go and attach that to your femur, and you shorten this muscle, what's going to happen? You are flexing the thigh over your trunk, right? So that is flexion of the thigh at the hip. So these muscles are going to originate on the hip bones or in the vertebral column, and they're going to insert on the femur, and they're going to cross anteriorly the hip joint. If they cross the joint, the hip joint, posteriorly, what you're going to put? Well, now you're going to cross it posteriorly. When you contract, you're going to extend or hyperextend the thigh at the hip. Please get used to name these movements properly. What happened if you put now your rubber band in your inner side, in your inner thigh? You're going to cross the hip joints medially. So what you're going to do when you contract that muscle, when you shorten that muscle, you're going to close your thigh, and that is called adduction. From anywhere here to here, you contract, you adduct. If you cross now the hip joint from, let's say, laterally, from anywhere in the hip joint to your femur, and you contract that muscle, you shorten that muscle, you lift the femur, so you are abducting now, you're opening up the thighs, right? Like that. So that is abduction of the thigh at the hip joint. Medial and lateral rotation, we will discuss that on the lab. Now, on the thigh, remember that we described on the arm and on the forearm in the previous video two compartments, the anterior and the posterior. Those compartments, by the way, are created by dense sheets of dense regular connective tissue, very dense, that separates these muscles and group these muscles into these compartments. In the thigh and in the leg, instead of two, we have three. Now things cannot be that easy. So we have three muscle compartments, and the sheet, the name of that sheet that is creating those compartments is the fascia latae. So it descends, and on the thigh, it creates three compartments. We have still, this is a cross section of the thigh through a cross section through the thigh, so we can see the cross section of the femur right in the middle. So we have still the anterior group, anterior to the femur, the posterior, well, this is the posterior group, posterior to the femur, and this is the medial group, medially to the femur. So anterior, posterior, and medial. The anterior muscles are located right in your anterior thigh. If these muscles, I'm going to grab my half of my skeleton in here. If these muscles are attaching or crossing the knee joint, right, because they are located on the thigh, they're going to move the leg because they're going to cross the knee joint. Remember, same principle. Let's describe that. If the muscle is crossing the hip joint, it's going to move the thigh. If a muscle crossing the hip joint is going to move the thigh or the femur. If a muscle is crossing the knee joint, it's going to move the leg or the tibia and fibula. If it's crossing the ankle, it's going to move the ankle or the toes, okay? So, on the thigh, we have the anterior compartment, anterior to the femur, the posterior compartment, posterior to the femur, and the medial compartment on the medial side. I'm sorry, I keep seeing the screen. On the medial side, on the same side of the tibia. Okay? So if these muscles, let's say they're just crossing the knee joint, when I contract the knee joint, see, remember that we twist during fetal development, that now in the thigh, the extensors are located on the anterior aspect. See what happens if I contract this muscle. See, this is anterior. Here is the, okay, even better. This is the patella, and let's say that this is the quadriceps tendon attaching to the tibia. Okay, so the muscle goes from the femur to the patella to the tibia. What happens when I contract, when I shorten this muscle? See? Extension. That's anatomical position. Now, if I place a muscle, okay, on the posterior compartment behind the femur to in any of the bones of the leg, when I contract that muscle, I can lift the leg. And this is called flexion of the leg at the knee. Okay? This is posterior. I hope you're oriented on that. But what else? What if the muscle that I'm describing in here crossing anteriorly the knee joint is also crossing anteriorly the hip joint? So it's going to cause flexion, right, of the thigh at the knee, and also, I'm back, and also extension of the leg at the knee. Okay, so in the anterior compartment of the thigh, I repeat, we're going to find the extensor muscles of the knee. Okay, extensor muscles of the knees. Basically, this is just the quadriceps muscles, but the quadriceps have 4 muscles. All of them can extend the leg at the knee. But one of them, the rectus femoris and the sartorius, actually 2 muscles in there, can also flex the thigh at the hip because they cross the hip joint anteriorly. Okay, so they have 2 movements: flexion at the hip, extension at the knee. Innervation femoral nerve. Let's go to the opposite compartment, to the antagonist compartment. In here we have the hamstrings, which is the posterior compartment, this one. In there, the hamstrings consist of 4 muscles. Same thing. They're going to cross posteriorly the hip joint and the knee joint. When they're crossing posteriorly the hip joint, they can perform extension of the thigh at the hip. But when they're crossing posteriorly the knee joint, they can flex the leg at the knee joint. Okay, and all of those muscles are innervated by the sciatic nerve or a branch of the sciatic nerve, usually the tibial nerve. And the last group of muscles in here is the medial muscle, and those medial muscles are located in the inner thigh, in your inner thigh, like this. See? So it makes sense that when you contract these muscles, you adduct the thigh. And all of them are innervated by the obturator nerve, I'm sorry. Okay, let's describe now the leg. The muscles of the leg, most of them originate on the femur. Okay, so let's use, they originate somewhere on the femur. They cross the knee joint and they cross the ankle joint. Others originate just on the tibia or fibula and just cross anteriorly, posteriorly, laterally, or medially the ankle joint. So the muscles, and in here, I'm sorry, we're still having 3 compartments. Those 3 compartments that we have on the thigh, the anterior, posterior, and medial, the same fascia descends towards the leg and create three compartments: anterior, posterior, and lateral. So on the thigh, we have a medial compartment. On the legs, we have a lateral compartment. So the anterior muscles, all the anterior group of muscles are going to, imagine again that I have my rubber band in here. I'm in an anatomical position. So when I contract this muscle, I can perform, what is the movement? Dorsiflexion. And if this muscle happens just to goes to the toes or extend to the toes, I'm just going to extend the toes. So I can either dorsiflex at the ankle or extend the toes. These group of muscles are innervated by the superficial fibular nerve. So here is the tibia, this is the fibula, this is the anterior group of the anterior compartment of the leg. Okay, so again, dorsiflexion, extension of toes, innervation, superficial fibular, deep fibular nerve. Now, the posterior group, the opposite or antagonist group, located right behind or posterior to the tibia and fibula. All of these bigger compartment consist of muscles that are crossing the ankle joint posteriorly. Okay, so if I attach a muscle down here and I contract this muscle, I can now see, whoop, perform plantar flexion, or if I attach it to a, a toe, I can flex the toes. Okay, so plantar flexion, flexion at the toes, those are the actions of the posterior compartment of the leg, and they're innervated by the tibial nerve, just like the posterior compartment of the thigh. And the lateral compartment, the third compartment of the leg, in there we have just two muscles, fibulary muscles, okay, because they are on the same side of the fibula. And these muscles, and again, it makes a lot of sense if they're crossing the ankle joint laterally. When I shorten this muscle, when I contract, can you see? Oh, barely. You can see this muscle, this movement. This is eversion, eversion of the foot, bringing the lateral border of your foot up, okay, or your sole laterally. Those muscles are innervated by the superficial fibular nerve. That's it. So I hope this serves as an introduction to clear our minds, to have our concepts, organized. Is mandatory, is a must to have these perfectly clear in your minds before you jump into the study of the muscles individually on the lab. So see you on the next module. We're going to start talking about the nervous system. See you later, alligators.